So thank you, Simon. Yeah, I'm a consultant clinical neuropsychologist. I'm also a couple therapist, and I have an interest in mind-body practices as well. And I've spent most of my career in the NHS, in community neurorehab services, working in the kind of social messiness of acquired brain injury. I've been very fortunate to work in progressive services, particularly the last 13 years in Aylesbury, which is a very socially progressive approach to community rehab that had kind of family therapy, vocational rehab all integrated. But that took me to a point where I needed to do more away from the medical model that kind of frames everything we do in the NHS. So I left the NHS at the end of last year, and I now work clinically in a mixture of private practice and in the third sector with different brain injury charities, which for me has been just a godsend, just personally, because I've been able to move away completely from how many sessions of X, Y, and Z can you offer to how can you be present for survivors across their lifespan. So I do that 4 days a week, and then I'm an academic a day a week at Oxford Brookes, which allows me to work on the more kind of innovating rehab interventions. And a stream of that is the Tai Chi, yoga, mindfulness kind of work. And the other stream is relationship-focused work. So today I've been invited to talk about the social aspect and social cognition rehabilitation, which is a core interest of mine. And there are a few kind of reference points to work that's happening in Wales along the way, so I'll make sure to flag that up. I like to say, as I always do when I'm speaking in Wales, that I did my degree in Bangor, and I know this is the South Wales group, but I owe Wales a lot for my education and my career, and the inspiration I had up in Bangor when I did my undergraduate. So it's really nice always to reconnect back with Wales as a professional. Okay, so I've got lots of resources for survivors and families as well on my website, ripplingminds.com, which is my more relationships and psychotherapy focused website. I'll bring that up later, but anything that comes out of that, do check that out for resources you can pass on to the people you're working with. Alrighty, so I just like to set the scene by thinking about this curious aspect of social cognition in neurorehab, because it's an interesting one. You know, it wouldn't be controversial for me to say that social decimation characterizes many people's lives after brain injury, that strain on relationships around the survivor and the isolation of the survivor, the breakdown of relationships in the family and the community. So that's not a controversial thing to say. Yet neurorehab services remain largely focused on the individual and not on relationships. And at the same time, there's another piece of the jigsaw here is that in the last 20 years, there's been this social neuroscience revolution. It's gone a bit quieter now, but definitely 10 years ago, all the headlines are about the brain basis of empathy discovered, and you know, lots of really exciting work on the neural hardware that supports our connections with other people. Yet you juxtapose that with a dearth of rehab interventions, you know, that there wasn't much kind of a translational research or applications. Okay, how do you support people who have damage to that hardware for their social comprehension? And how do you use contemporary social neuroscience to inform that? There's still a dichotomy there and a gap between the knowledge available to us to inspire innovation in this area versus actually what's happening on the ground. So we're going to have a little look at that. And I think this is, you know, this is part of my soapbox, and apologies if you've heard this before, but there really is an elephant in the room in rehab. You know, rehab is focused on, it fetishizes independence. It's focused on the individualized survivor, unless it focuses on interdependence, on what happens between people. be that a family, a couple, a community, the employment setting, colleagues, relationships in the workplace around survivors. So there are lots of dots that kind of need to be joined here. So potentially, I think this is quite an interesting area. But you may reflect on, is social cognition part of your practice? Do you assess social cognition? Do you use that information in your interventions? Are you aware of approaches to rehab interventions or how it might connect with psychotherapy interventions? Once I'm aware that, the standard kind of domains of cognition to be assessed in a neuropsych assessment doesn't include social cognition typically. And sometimes that gets factored into assessment of dysexecutive problems, but even executive functioning still isn't as contemporary as it should be in terms of clinical neuropsychology practice. And social cognition is off the map, I think. I've just become part of the team that's setting up a third clinical neuropsychology training course in Salomons. And I'm really excited to make sure that social cognition is a core dimension of learning in that, both assessment and intervention. So hopefully we can update that and bring social cognition into core clinical neuropsychology practice. And hopefully today I can inspire some of you to do the same if you're not doing so currently. All right, so just going forward, we'll have a little introduction. We'll have a look at common social cognition difficulties in neuroconditions. My practice is with acquired brain injury, but I've included references to progressive conditions too. We'll look at paradigms for intervention, and the intervention literature is so embryonic. All is possible, and very, very few things have been tried. So it's a fresh kind of scene for us to explore. And then what I'll do for the second part of the talk is to go through how we apply those ideas to different types of social relationships, from couples and family to workplace to community and friendship. And then finally to us, ourselves. I'm going to end with thinking about us as a social relationship, particularly those of us who work long-term with people with neurological conditions, and how our therapeutic relationship can be challenged and undermined by these very same deficits and impairments that challenge other relationships around survivors and patients. So that's the plan. And like I say, we'll have a toilet break halfway through. So let's get stuck into it. Right, so what are we talking about here? Well, first of all, we need to consider how do we conceptualize what we're talking about. What would a social cognition impairment be in a neuro condition? Well, we could start with the things we're familiar with and note the social implications of common neuropsychological impairments. So let's take attention. We know there's a socially specialized attentional system mediated by the superior temporal sulcus and the temporal pole. And this is that orientating reflex that, if we were in a group and I saw something horrific and I turned to look at it, everyone else would orientate quickly and prioritize a shared stimulus as a priority for our attentional focus. And the developmental literature shows that this socially shared attention is a precursor for mentalizing. And this is one of the first cues that this might go awry in developmental conditions like autistic spectrum disorder kind of variation and things like that. So attention-wise, there's a socially specialized version. And I've worked with people who have impairments in this nature following a stroke, and it is socially devastating. I worked with one guy who wanted to check an email from work. He's trying to get back to work after a stroke, and he saw his laptop there in the house, and he went and picked it up and started tapping his emails away without realizing that his kids were watching Peppa Pig on the laptop. And at that moment, his social attention was not in sync with the attention of his family. And in that moment, he became the stranger, post-stroke stranger, not our dad, intruder into the family for his kids. So it can be devastating to have this specific impairment to not orientate your attention. And then as we get to higher levels of attentional control into executive difficulties, many studies have shown the associative relationships between impairments of working memory, initiation, inhibition, attentional switching, and different social outcomes. That's quite a repeated finding now across studies. That makes sense. And you know, there's an issue. Other people have caught the Disabilities Trust publication on domestic violence that came out in the last couple of weeks. But there's a big link here, obviously, with like executive difficulties and relationship conflict and breakdown at home, and the increased risks of that during social isolation at the minute. But just to think about how these executive difficulties can have a social consequence, there's a really fascinating qualitative study by Gill and colleagues in 2011 that explored intimacy. And they showed how survivors said that if a survivor struggled with set shifting or attention, switching of attention, cognitive inflexibility, then the kind of the unprompted natural evolution of an intimate encounter with a partner just becomes impossible. You know, we're sat here watching the TV, and suddenly my partner wants some close, intimate contact. What's happening here? I thought we were watching TV. You know, this is TV time, not sex time. So the whole kind of social kind of impact of not being able to fluidly switch and evolve a state of mind that many of our relationships and qualities of interaction, particularly emotionally charged ones, require is difficult. So we know that these difficulties here have social consequences. Now if we move on to the social cognition impairments themselves, the socially specialized ones, how do we go about thinking about that? So a good standard comprehensive approach would be a boxes and arrows, let's line up all the impairments and see how they relate to each other. And for that kind of approach, I recommend you to the most recent take on that, which is by Anneli Castle and colleagues from Guy MacDonald's group in New South Wales. If you Google Scholar this, you can get this wonderfully comprehensive review paper. You can download it for free. And there's a nice boxes and arrows kind of model that we're used to in our profession that links out all the main social cognition difficulties, links it to awareness of difficulties, links it to other domains of cognition, and links it to social context and social complexity. So it's the most comprehensive approach I've seen. So it's really good for a good kind of a compartmentalizing and interconnecting of all the different studies. But there are alternatives for us to view. And I think the one limitation of this kind of a model, it kind of holds that the social outputs and the social relationships are quite routine and unchanging. So the same kind of social cognitive impairment will have the same kind of manifestation moment to moment. Whereas I think the more you get into this, the more you realize that different social interactions require different skills and require different kinds of resonance between two or more brains in serving a complex social interaction between two or more people. So the one approach to thinking about social cognition impairments that really captivated me back in 2004 was by the Palmer group. They're the group that discovered mirror neurons. And they always took a very relational approach. They say, rather than going for a boxes and arrows approach, you know, so something like theory of mind into psychological literature, they said, let's see what emerges between two or more people, between two or more brains as they interact with each other in different ways. So they talked about something called the intersubjective field or intersubjective space. So when two people are relating to each other in one kind of a way, what is the quality that connects them? When two or more people are relating in a different kind of way, what is the different quality that connects them? And what neural systems are differentially involved in those different kinds of interactions? So I'm going to take that approach, and I hope that makes sense as we look at each kind of impairment in turn. And it rests on the idea of a very relational perspective of viewing mind as not located in one head, but distributed across relationships. Okay, so let's take the first group. So this would be traditionally called theory of mind difficulties or mentalizing difficulties. And Galezi and colleagues in Parma talk about it as a perspectival intersubjective space. So this is a connection between people that is mediated by difference, an orientation to difference. So what are we talking about here? It's the act of stepping into someone else's shoes. Things that we do a lot in our jobs, right? To make a connection to someone whose experience of the world is very different to your own. And this kind of interaction requires hard work, conscious thinking, and effort for the most part. And there's been a clearly mapped out distributed network here involving the medial frontal lobes, the superior temporal sulcus, and the temporal pole. And this allows us to step in the shoes and think about things from different perspectives and also anticipate responses. This is working out, you know, what someone else may be thinking, or their beliefs and intentions and perspectives. Now, there's some really interesting work in Birmingham has shown that after, say, brain injury, there are kind of two broad categories of mentalizing failures. That one is, you know that someone else thinks something different to you, but you can't make the jump into their shoes to know what that would be. But a more profound one is to not realize that someone would think something different from you in the first place, to be solely rooted in your egocentric view of the world and not even entertain that there would be a different perspective. And many of you, I think, could think of your different clients you've supported and think about people who know that they need to understand someone else's perspective but struggle to do that, versus people that are blissfully unaware that other perspectives exist and struggle with the consequences when they bash up against that. You know, this, so the literature has been demonstrated this in acquired conditions like traumatic brain injury and stroke, and different progressive conditions that I've put here. It's a, you know, very dynamic source of literature. So the other angle on this is, if people struggle to mentalize, what do their errors look like? How do their mentalizing errors appear and manifest? So we've been involved in a bit of research in this over the last few years. And we've used a kind of vignette story, the recognition of faux pas test, to look at this. And this is kind of like an evolved test from like the basic Sally-Ann paradigm, where someone does something that another person is not privy to, and then their behavior is a result of not being privy to shared information. So I'll just talk us through this one example. So in this story, Jill had just moved into a new apartment. Jill went shopping and bought some new curtains for her bedroom. When she had just finished decorating the apartment, her best friend Lisa came over. Jill gave her a tour of the apartment and asked, "How do you like my bedroom?" "Those curtains are horrible," Lisa said. "I hope you're going to get some new ones." So that's, you get stories like that. And then the questions that follow is, did someone say something that they shouldn't have said, and why did they say it? So you might see this, realize that Lisa was not privy to Jill's shopping trip, and Lisa had assumed that the curtains were from the previous owner, and no offense to be called by making this kind of statement. And there are lots of other vignettes that follow this line. People saying something that causes offense, but not intentionally so. This is kind of, people have been studying this and seeing how actually there seems to be a bit of a trend that survivors after brain injury as a group will actually not assume that there's a benevolent misunderstanding here, and will go down the lines that people are saying hurtful things deliberately. And in our research, we've linked that, we're looking at that as a vulnerability factor in development and maintenance of PTSD after brain injury. So like a double traumatization in a way. And other studies have looked at certain subtypes of brain damage, particularly the medial frontal damage, are more likely to have this negative attribution versus other types of damage. And so early they're trying to work out what makes some people respond in a negative way. And when I say negative way, I'll give you this as an example, actually. So these are the kind of responses that people would have to the vignette. So the person did it because it was cruel, arrogant, uncaring, because he was an arse, a sick joke, a nasty little school kid, arrogant, big I am. I'll go. So these are verbatim quotes to people are saying, no, the characters in these stories are saying hurtful things deliberately. And there are other studies that are mapping out this dynamic that Valerie Stone and colleagues who developed the faux pas test said that their responses from their brain injury participants included, he just went up to an equal and said, on your knees, boy. She's trying to put Christine down, like making himself one up and gloating. He was trying to make Helen feel jealous. So, you know, clear attributions, clear mentalizing of the minds of others being quite malevolent and persecutory in nature. And Knox and Douglas, in their study of emotion recognition, have said that even when some of the brain injury participants got the emotion right, they would elaborate on the mentalizing behind the scenes in quite an unusual way. So in the example here, Knox and Douglas, 2009, they correctly identified that the face they're looking at was expressing a happy face, a happy expression. But it said, she's got a smile on her face, but actually she thinks, I hate you. So there's this kind of jump behind the facial display to mentalizing the minds of others in quite a negative way. So this is interesting work on, there's a trend of any neutral social stimuli being interpreted in quite a negative way. And Barbara Zupan has done some work there. And Dawn Newman in the States has developed a lot of work on this hostility bias in TBI, social encoding and comprehension, and the link between that and anger and irritability issues. So it's a really interesting developing story that people are skewing when they're making mentalizing mistakes, when they're not accurately inferring the intentions and perspectives of other people, they do it in a negative way. So we'll come back to mentalizing in a little while. Let's shift now. Let's shift to a different kind of social interaction between people, a different kind of intersubjective space, and then let's see how that can undermine. So Gillespie talks about another kind of intersubjective space, the we-centric intersubjective space. So in contrast to the mentalizing and the perspectival, this one is about sameness, not difference. And this is automatic and bodily based. So I'll give you an example to really capture this system in operation between people. Think of your own experiences. Think, have you ever walked into a room and there's just been an argument? And you weren't privy to the argument, but you walked in and you can feel it in the air. You can feel it on your skin. You can feel the seething between the other people concerned. And you're like, I've got to get out of here. You can feel it. Now this is key. You can feel it. You don't work it out in a kind of cold, logical, Vulcan kind of way, Spock kind of way. You actually, your body lets you know that there's something wrong here. There's some kind of problem or threat between people. And then your brain catches up, or your thinking brain catches up. So this is the area that's really more relevant to emotion recognition perception amongst a range of other social phenomena. And this is first kind of explored by the mirror neuron group when they discovered mirror neurons, which I'll have a little look at in a minute. But first it was viewed as, okay, for me to feel what other people are feeling, we need to do that quickly. You know, if someone in your social group is feeling murderous, everyone else needs to feel that feeling rather than work it out in a slow way. So the kind of metaphors used to understand that this kind of connection is more based on resonance, contagion, synchrony, attunement, rather than working it out deliberately in your head. So if you think about social phenomena such as contagious coughing or laughter, that wave of coughing that happens before a performance, the way many things, the way that body language mimicry happens, lots of things happen in a non-conscious kind of way. And it's kind of similar to like a murmuration of starlings or a shoal of fish, less about individuals working it out by themselves. So this quality was first explained by Giles and colleagues in their study of the mirror neuron system, particularly the inferior parietal and inferior frontal system. And there's a famous study where they were looking at cells that were firing for hand motor movements and mouth motor movements in a macaque monkey. And they'd paused after recording these cells. Well, the story goes that the presenters were all enjoying a gelato ice cream in their break. And the monkey was sat there looking at them, looking at the researchers moving their arms up and down, having their ice creams. And then the cells of the macaque monkey started firing. So instead of the monkey moving its hands, the same cells were firing the same way for other people moving their hands in the same way. And they found that this mirroring quality characterized many other systems that are connected to social interactions. But yet, think about that homunculus, the big mouth, the big hands, big eyes, these really important social dimensions of embodiment. And indeed, this has been found for other systems as well, which we'll have a look at. So this is something where certain systems in our brain fire regardless of if it's us or someone else. And it's very much the idea of tuning forks coming to vibrate together now, rather than I'm seeing someone else doing something, I'm working it out in my head, and then I copy it. It's not that slow. It's everyone feeling and having a neural activity that's corresponding at the same time. And so this has been explored as a quality of certain emotions as well. Let me just see. So this has been shown for anger and anxiety experience in amygdala activation, and also for disgust, pain, and sadness in anterior cingulate activation. So these systems fire when someone is experiencing that emotion, and also fire when someone else is being witnessed as expressing that same emotion. And when you go about assessing this, and in clinical practice or in the literature, so that there are selective knockouts of different emotions in a patient's ability to recognize and sometimes also experience that emotion inside you. So fear and anger, disgust, pain and sadness have been the main ones. Happiness also in one study. And it's not a one-for-one overlap, but there's a big overlap between experiencing an emotion and recognizing the emotion. And for many people with neurological conditions, both can be knocked out at the same time. Think about an artist's palette for different colors. Someone can lose the red, so they no longer have red to work with in either their experience of an emotion or their recognition of an emotion in other people. So people can report no longer experiencing fear and anger in the same way. At the same time, they struggle to recognize that emotion in other people. And also similar findings for progressive conditions here. So we have two systems of comprehending and connecting with other people and understanding other people, understanding the minds of others. So that deliberate perspectival mentalizing theory of mind system, and then the more automatic bodily based feeling system of attuning to other people's emotional state. And all those can be undermined, as we see. And then the final group is, if you have that information, how do you respond as per the conventions of a social encounter in your given culture? Of course, this is all socially constructed, but within your socially constructed rules, how can that unfold in the context of neurological conditions? And literature has shown a range of ways in which this can unfold. People lose the ability to maybe either lose social knowledge itself following medial temporal damage of what's appropriate or not, or they may have that knowledge but are unable to access that knowledge in the hot moment-to-moment unfolding of a social encounter. Some people struggle to socially problem solve. They might be able to practically problem solve, but not socially problem solve. Social proxemics, that's an interesting one. That's respect of other people's personal space. Less of an issue at the moment with social distancing. We don't have to worry about getting too close to people in an unintentional kind of way. I think that's made the world a bit more black and white for people now than it ever has been. But Robin Morris and colleagues showed how orbitofrontal damage was more likely to lead people to invade people's personal space than other forms of dorsolateral frontal damage or posterior damage. And social space is a hugely socially constructed thing, isn't it? In the UK, we like our space more than Mediterranean or Asian cultures, for example. But whatever the social rules are about that, your orbitofrontal and medial frontal cortex helps you adhere to those rules, and it can unfold. And then there's the kind of bringing affect into this. There's affect regulation, and again, this is one of the first Wales shout out Roger Wood's work on affect regulation. And we have to do that in a work context. We have to know how to put a lid on things, don't we, and regulate our emotions in a different way than we would do behind closed doors. And that shifting scale of how to regulate your emotions with varying levels of parameters of leeway is a really tricky business if it doesn't work in the way you've been used to. And then there's Damasio's work on using gut feelings, somatic markers to guide decision-making in socially ambiguous scenarios. And that can, if you read any of Antonio Damasio's books and papers, you can see how that can unfold. And so these same difficulties have been shown in progressive conditions here too. All right, so taking this idea further, the body is key to this, right? So this is, Damasio and Becker have showed in '94 how following ventromedial frontal damage, if you take a skin conductance measure, when certain survivors see distressing scenes or see an image of someone requiring assistance, there is no response in the skin. There's a blunted response in the skin, in the way there would be an enhanced response in the skin when someone with a healthy brain would be moved with compassion and empathy to alleviate the distress of other people. That just doesn't happen in the same way on a bodily level. It's seen. And Olson and colleagues have shown that to access knowledge about what's appropriate or inappropriate, you have emotional tags that help you do that quickly in the moment. And Damasio's work has shown that it's the bodily feelings, the emotional tags that guide a quick series of social problem-solving moves by people, and magnifies the recruitment of other neuropsychological systems into solving a social problem or scenario. So the body is key in this. All right. So it can unfold in different ways. I've mentioned a few tests along the way. Here's a list. There are newer ones now, but these are lists of the ones that have been used across research, and you may have lying around. Some of them are like the top two there, you can just download from Baron Cohen's website. So some things don't require a price tag, and others are worth getting. I mean, for 13 years, I routinely used the tacit in vocational rehab and in supporting our couples and family work. And the information I got from that was so valuable. that I couldn't imagine not using it now as part of a neuropsych assessment. If you know that someone has a selective knockout in recognizing certain emotions, but their recognition of other emotions are intact, that's really important information. Or to know how someone mentalizes other people, it's really important information. All right. So that's how it can go wrong. Oh, also a quick shout out to Claire Williams' work in Swansea around alexithymia. Alexithymia is this kind of difficulty in expressing or connecting with affective embodied experience to express that in words and make decisions and actions around that. At the minute, that's assessed by a questionnaire, and I think the methodology is problematic because, as we see later on, someone's ability to tune into their emotions is not a fixed thing; it waxes and wanes. So, but I think it's important that we explore how thinking and speaking around emotions can be complicated or otherwise following brain injury. All right, so rehab. What do we do about it? I'm just going to give us a little time check here. Okay. All right. So you can break it down, and one of the handouts includes a review paper I did on this 6 years ago now, but it still largely holds now. You can break it down into a certain groups of interventions. So here's the overview graphic from that paper here. So approaches to social cognition rehabilitation would include, if you look on your left, the orange bubble, that's training a skill, okay? Coming out of the social skills training approach. We'll talk about that first. And then the other approach is actually using an embodied approach, how you use the body of the survivor to guide their social comprehension and behavior. And which is more of an innovation in the last 10 years or so. And then the bubble in the bottom of the green is actually how you use live social relationships as a vehicle for social cognition rehabilitation. So let's start off with the traditional approach to it. Can you train it? Well, the academic researchers would say, yes, you can. And if you think about social skills training packages, pen and paper versions that we're kicking about in the learning disabilities field for many, many years, you know, learning how to understand or find out information about other people's point of view, learning how to recognize emotional cues of other people, maybe role-playing social scenarios to help with problem solving. That's gone from pen and paper versions to high-tech computer-delivered versions. And there are a range of packages now done in the States, in the Netherlands, and in Australia mainly. And this approach has been used in neurorehab, also in the ASD literature, and in the psychosis literature more recently as well. It may have a role, but I think, you know, as clinicians, we would wonder if a statistically significant change in the ability to recognize an emotion on a computer package would carry over to any everyday real world game. And I think in some situations it might, which I'll come back to later on. But I don't think it cuts the mustard when it comes to, say, the emotional needs of a romantic partner or something like that. But it's not a bad start, but and it's the go-to paradigm for intervention for all the academics. And like I said, the current version of it now would be for a survivor to be plugged up into different stimuli presented on the computer to support their emotion recognition ability or their mentalizing steps in their mind to understand the perspectives of other people. And actually, indeed, one group, the Netherlands group, uses a CBT hot cross bun model to help people make links between triggers, thoughts, feelings, and behavior in other people. Very interesting approach. But this approach has not taken on board the social neuroscience revolution and the discovery of mirror neurons and the discovery of emotional responsivity. So other groups have tried to take this on board. So what do I mean by this? So not enough people are doing this, but a few groups, a couple of people said, okay, let's try and use mirror neuron theory in rehab. And the first group that did that was actually a physio intervention to see if mirroring of physical movements of others would help with physical intervention. But then Skye MacDonald and her group in New South Wales and Australia were the first to see, can we bring mirroring into social cognition rehab? So what happens? Let me, what they did is, if I kind of go back here, so, jump ahead. So imagine someone is looking at a screen and they are seeing some stimuli like this, like the Ekman and Friesen spaces. And they're trying to recognize what emotion they're seeing. So in an intervention inspired by mirror neuron theory, the researchers said, before you tell me what emotion you're seeing, make your face look like the face you're seeing. So deliberate mirroring. And then the person would do that. So they say they look at the top left face and they would make a grimace. And then they say, now tell me what emotion you're seeing. So rather than just doing it in the head, they're bringing in the body and the mimicry of the face. So let me go back to where we got to. Really interesting idea to bring in the body. But unfortunately, mixed results, it didn't really help, didn't work all of the time. And then we have to ask the question, is forcing someone to mimic their face to someone else's face the same thing as the automatic occurrence of that mimicry in everyday life? Because this goes back to a kind of a debate in the literature about when mimicry happens. So when you see someone with an angry state of mind and they have an angry facial expression, do you automatically mimic that? Do you feel the anger and your face automatically mimics an angry expression of the person? Or do you have to deliberately do it step by step? One really interesting study that kind of hints the fact that this is all very automatic is that Dimberg and colleagues in Scandinavia presented the Ekman and Friesen faces subliminally. So they showed that when people were watching like the Ekman and Friesen faces, when they consciously saw an angry face on their screen, their face would automatically mimic an angry face, very subtly. But when you put sensors on the musculature of the face, you'll see that if any of us would see an angry face, we subtly mimic an angry face. A happy face, we subtly mimic happiness. Disgusted. So that automatically happens. And that's been demonstrated reliably across studies. So Dimberg and colleagues presented the emotional faces so quickly that the participants only saw static. They didn't know if they'd seen a happy face, a sad face, a disgusted face, or any face at all. Yet the sensors showed that the participants still mimicked accurately each affect they saw in the faces, even though they consciously hadn't seen the faces. So as you imagine, the psychoanalysts love this data. This is unconscious emotional communication demonstrated. But what it does show is that this is mimicking your face when you see another emotion is done in an automatic way in a healthy brain. And so forcing that, getting someone to do it deliberately may not be activating the same systems. It's a bit like that thing of laughter therapy, to what extent you can train yourself to laugh versus natural laughter and all of that. So this promising, but somehow we need to find a way to automatically cue a mimic bodily based response to a social cue. Now, the group in Netherlands, in Groningen, someone called Herma Westerhoff-Evers, have developed a package. It's a training package called the T-SEMO that trains emotion recognition and mentalizing, but they've linked in embodied cues as well. So they've done a really interesting bit of work where they'll put on an angry, they showed an example of putting on a a face of someone who was scared. And the brain injury survivor participant was looking at this face, and they couldn't tell if the person was scared or surprised in a pleasant way. And so first they asked the survivor to, okay, can you make your face look like that? So they consciously mimicked the face they were looking at. Then they said, now just try and remember any time you might have felt something like this before in your life. And the survivor, making their face look like a scared, anxious face, then cast their mind back and remembered the time they were chased by a gang of youths. They said, oh, I'm feeling scared. Oh, the person's scared. So they tried to use memory plus facial mimicry to cue an empathic response. So that's interesting. And the other thing that may be, and this is all embryonic, this is all really new literature. You know, we're not there to a definitive approach, but another angle on this is that unlike Becker's first study that people have absent emotional body cue to social stimuli, maybe for many people with neurological conditions, the cue to have a bodily based empathic response isn't absent, it's just really blunted down. And so maybe if you turn the volume up on the external cue, you might breach some kind of a threshold and trigger an empathic response. So if the cues weren't so subtle, maybe it might breach something, connect with the survivor, and the empathy kind of flows out, maybe. So there is some evidence of this experimentally, including Oliver Turnbull's work in Bangor, so another Wales shout out here. And there's some ideas that are coming from the therapeutic work that I'll share in a little while. So maybe rather than an absence or a presence of empathy ability, Simon Baron-Cohen did a book called 0 Degrees of Empathy. Maybe it's a sliding scale, and maybe you can turn up the volume on the empathic response. Maybe. We'll come back to that later. And yeah, so in terms of the cueing approaches, now linked to an embodied approach, I think the group in Holland, their T-SEMO intervention is the most interesting one. And I'll tell you a bit more about that in a little while. All right. The other thing you can do, obviously, is go back to those supporting the socially adjunctive cognitive processes. So some of this work has looked at, actually, do survivors focus their attention on the right parts of the face to pick up the right sources of information? So that's present in some of this cueing, like an attentional intervention to help people focus on the right thing. And it's a particular work on eye gaze that both developmentally on autistic spectrum conditions and also acquired people, if there's amygdala damage or amygdala difference, then people won't automatically look at the eyes and mouths of other people during social interactions the way that the majority of people would. And so missing out important social cues. And there's some interesting social problem solving work that you can explore as well. All right. So I'm just going to do a little bit on this, and then we'll have a break for those who want to have a 5-minute break. So those are all socially. So those approaches are kind of like training skills, but in the parallel world of psychotherapy, there are similar approaches to supporting people in their social relationships with others. So for me, mentalization-based therapy, as explored by Peter Fonagy and Anthony Bateman, is of real interest to us working with neuroconditions. Although the approach was developed for borderline personality disorder, there's a whole psychotherapeutic approach to being alongside people who struggle to understand the minds of other people, and particularly to use particular psychotherapeutic techniques to stop someone being so certain that they're dealing with malevolent minds and other people. So people with the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, often that's characterized by intense affective dysregulation, lots of conflict with other people, and they experience the minds of other people in quite a persecutory kind of way. And so MBT kind of takes that up and tries to make the person feel safe enough to entertain the uncertainty that they don't know what other people are thinking or feeling, and to explore that. And there are different techniques in that work, which I don't have time to go into today. But it's a different approach to, say, like a CBT framework that Spitman and colleagues used as a way of assisting mentalizing. And importantly, MBT is focused on the therapeutic relationship. So the first aim of MBT is to stop a patient telling you to piss off and not coming back again, to support them, to tolerate you enough to come back to the next therapy session so they can work with you to manage their other social relationships. And I think that's something we need in neurorehab, tools to help us navigate our therapeutic relationships with our clients who struggle with relationships of any kind. So it's worth checking that out. Right, time for a little break, guys. Let's have a little breather for 5 minutes, and we'll come back then.
I've got to permit that. Yeah, I was saying that John Gottman and that group have a paradigm where the two people in the couple talk. I think there's autonomic measures and they're filmed. After that, the interviewers, the researchers code the emotion and the verbal content of the conversation. Then what happens is one member of the couple looks at the video and says what they think the other person was thinking at that point, and what were they feeling at that point. And obviously they've got autonomic measures and all the rest of it. And then the other person in the couple separately does exactly the same thing. So then you've got, and I'm just thinking, I'm not sure where that would fit, but I've been thinking, how would that fit in? Because I could see it would be ecologically valid, and you could look at it with certain measures, measures of emotional function. You could, so it would be good for research. I don't know how, you'd have to have a specific plan, but I could see that, and then I could see actually it happen in a clinical research, because if you had a couple that was safe, you could, might give permission to do that, and you might do something along with that kind of stuff. You might actually use it for formulation in certain people. What is it autonomic thing not working, or you wouldn't exactly say that, but or is it facial recognition of facial emotion that's not working? Is it that they're not hearing the emotion? That you could see that doing it that way, you would actually be able to get a lot of measures. And then if you had a couple that was safe, you'd worked with a long time, it might be maybe at some stage towards the end of when they're sort of noting the process that goes on between them, it might be actually really quite helpful at that point to sort of say, this is the sequence.
Definitely. I think I've seen that research as well. I think it might have been you told me about it years and years ago, Roger. I'm not sure, but I think, getting that autonomic measurement in the core clinical practice research is definitely a key way to go forward. I'll share a bit of that in a minute, actually, but you're totally on it.
All right.
Sorry to interrupt, Roger, but could we commence again?
Yeah.
I'll not put that comment in then. I've said it now, so I'll shut up.
That's great. Thank you very much. So if everyone could remember to mute their microphones again, and we can progress. Thanks very much.
Right, hold on. Oh, I've lost my position. Give me 1 minute, guys. Okay. All right, so for the last bit, thank you for persisting, everyone. Last bit, I'm going to just take a tour of different social relationships and how those ideas around both assessment, conceptualization, but also intervention may be applied. So this is my the main domain of practice that I've been involved in the last couple of decades. And I think this is right more than any other domain of social relationship for a social cognition intervention. We all know about caregiver strain and burden from the early studies, you know, some of which Roger Waddell was involved in. And we know that the predictors of caregiver strain and burden include things that would now be described as social cognition impairment. But it's also complicated because the distress of the relatives also it has a recursive impact on the social cognition of the survivors. And I know Roger Waddell does some wonderful work on personality change judgments in relatives of survivors, and often the mental health of the relatives is the stronger predictor than any neurobehavioral or injury-related indices. You know that relatives, you know, fit cases for anxiety and depression-based disorders, you know, really difficult real struggles for relatives around a survivor. There's one study that shows that mentalizing difficulties in survivors predicts caregivers' quality of life. So Boner and colleagues, 2015. And then while everyone is making sense of the strange consequences of brain injury, and that's a challenge for survivors and relatives, and struggling with social isolation, struggling with breakdown relationships, there is a particular role here for relationships, social cognition difficulties being predictors of relationships. They're both studied by Delonder and colleagues, and emotion recognition difficulties predicted aspects of the couple's relationship. Study that I did with Roger Waddell that we have yet to get published. It will be published soon, Roger. I promise. Also predicted this as well, which I'll show in a minute. So if it makes sense, doesn't it, that if mentalizing emotion recognition difficulties in survivors will be related to family breakdown, family problems. But again, it's thinking about how to apply that in clinical work. So, you know, there's been some really interesting suggestions around parenting skills, interventions for survivors. Again, to kind of assist survivors in relearning or learning for the first time how to be a parent, using maybe like, you know, the Webster-Stratton model and things like that. And, you know, we've advocated the role of family work in neurorehab many places. But actually, going back to psychotherapy literature, there are mentalization-based therapies geared for families, including like the Lighthouse model that's been developed here in Oxford by Jerry Byrne, where the skill of mentalizing, the skill of understanding other people's perspectives is the core element of the parenting or the family intervention. That has yet to be applied into brain injury. You're going to hear me talk about emotionally focused couples therapy in a little while. There's a family version of that offers potential contribution to neurorehab as well. So couples work has been my main area. I won't go into this detail. You'll have lots of information in handouts, but we know that disconnection and experiences of alienation is core to couples' experiences after brain injury. These quotes illuminating this is like living with Jekyll and Hyde, waking up next to a stranger married to a husband. Palpable, extreme forms of distress in the relationship for often both the relative and the survivor. Now, actually it was for my clinical neuropsychology course in Glasgow, the study that I did, supervised by Roger Waddell, who's here today, no pressure on me right now. We found that certain things predicted the couple's relationship. And it wasn't, so the non-injured partners' ratings of aspects of the couple's relationship were not predicted by survivor difficulties with executive functioning or memory or attention, but social cognition functioning. So emotion recognition, mentalizing, the ability of survivors to identify a violation of social norms. They predicted either directly or via the mediation of the level of strain and distress of the non-injured partner. They predicted the overall quality of the relationship, the level of physical intimacy in the relationship, the way that the non-injured partner would respond, which I'll go into in a little minute. And then you've also got a theoretical review of the literature that map out different the potential relevance of different neuropsychological deficits for couples relationships. So in that article, there is this table where I go down each domain of neuropsychological functioning and think about how that can impact on a couple's relationship, including the social cognition impairments themselves. So in terms of couple support, what might be out there? So Dawn Newman and colleagues have done like a social cognition rehab group for couples, which came out last year. And that's very much an educational program, a skills-based training approach. So couples, survivors and their partners are together as a group. You can get this off Google Scholar and read it. They actually do use some Gottman ideas, actually, Roger Riddell, but they don't really use the potential. So it's more teaching, it's more educating rather than therapeutically working with the relationship itself. So it may offer some value. But I've been interested in taking some of the threads we've already looked at today. How can we support couples to actually find each other and connect in the moment as it's happening? Can we trigger an empathic response for the survivor so that they are there when their partner who's distressed needs them to be? So how could you do that? There might be different ways of doing that. You might try and intentionally cue someone to try and be deliberate, to try and offer an empathic response. Obviously, that's problematic. Doing it deliberately is not the same as automatically doing it. Or you might try and automatically cue an empathic response in survivors in the middle of a couples therapy session. So one approach in yellow would be trying to get the survivor to try and cue into their bodily experience. What does it feel like in their body when they see their partner cry? What does it feel like from them, you know, when they see their partner so far away from them? Try and find that embodied internal cue to help them trigger an empathic response to their partner. Or the final one, number 3, is to turn the volume up on the cue of the non-injured partner. So to get the non-injured partner to more clearly reach out to the survivor and say what they need from them. So turning up the volume on an external cue and trigger. That's problematic because one of the things that our study showed was that these neuropsychological functioning of the survivor predicts these aspects of the couple's relationship as rated by the partner, but it also predicts specifically the partner's tendency to pull away or be very conflictual in their responses. And if you think about that, that leads to a bit of a vicious cycle, because a survivor with difficulties in social cognition probably needs clearer and less ambiguous cues from their partner to know what to do, what the partner needs and feels. Instead, understandably, the distressed partner pulls away and withdraws to cope with the distress. And so the survivor now gets fewer cues rather than more cues. And you get this overdetermined of a negative cycle. So to get a partner to offer the right kind of external cues to the survivor, we need to attend to the partner's distress and make it safe that the partner is going to give the right kind of cues about what they need, rather than a load of criticism about what the person has done wrong, or to just pull away and say nothing. So we take that idea in using one approach to couples therapy, emotionally focused couples therapy. I won't go into the details of that here. You've got the article that Simon will have distributed to you all. So you can have a look at his 4 cases, 3 that went well, 1 that didn't go so well, and how he used this idea to support couples to attune to each other in the moment. All right. One thing I am going to say though, what's exciting is in the couples area, so in my academic role, I really want to step up the emotion-focused couples therapy to make it more of a neuro-adapted intervention. So I'm actually on another Zoom call tomorrow with the Dutch group who developed the TCMO social cognition intervention. And we're going to try and collaborate to see in emotion-focused couples therapy, does number 2 or number 3 work as a more potent approach to cueing empathy for survivors? So are survivors more likely in the middle of a couples therapy intervention, if the therapist in trying to create a moment of closeness of a couple goes for the internal sensations of the survivor to guide them there versus to go for amplifying the external cues of the partner, we're going to try and compare that in quite a structured way, both in an experimental condition and in a therapy. The reason why I'm doing it in Holland is that in the Netherlands, they have a social cognition group in Groningen, and they have many neuropsychologists are trained in emotionally focused couples therapy. I did a training event with them in January, and we had 70 neuropsychologists wanting to work in this way. So the conditions ideal to do quite an involved research collaboration linking social cognition rehab and couples therapy. And Roger, your points about autonomic responsivity mapping in this is definitely core to what we're planning to do. So hopefully I'll be able to update on that collaboration in a few years' time. Obviously, we're supposed to be doing this now, but lockdown's frozen all of this, but at least we're talking about it. So moving on. Let's move away from family. Workplace. A big trend of my professional life has been in vocational rehab. And we know that, and I think I've included this paper in your pack. You can get it off my ResearchGate profile if I haven't. We know that difficulties of social cognition and executive functioning predict negative employment outcomes. And we did a particular study of this 2016. It builds on existing literature so that in brain injury, survivors either are demoted or lose their job. Those are more likely to happen as a result of social cognition and executive difficulties rather than memory difficulties, physical difficulties, or the ability to do the job itself. And there's a range of findings that shows this. And I know that from doing VOC rehab myself, that employers are more happy to talk about the person's ability to do the job. It's a much tougher conversation to meet with an employer and a survivor and talk about the times that the survivor are freaking out the other employees by standing too close or making inappropriate remarks in the coffee breaks at work. Yet that's the thing that costs employment outcomes. So we know that social cognition impairments have a key role in vocational success for survivors. But of course, the workplace is different to the clinic or the family. You know, people go to work to do their job. They don't go to work to be therapists for a colleague. They don't go to work to be made to feel uncomfortable by someone saying inappropriate things to them when they have to do their job anyway. So it's a very different kind of system to work in supporting these kind of impairments. And we found in our study that it was 73 studies of survivors of brain injury and work placement. We had ratings from workplace supervisors that included job coaches or the employers themselves, and the placements in charity and industry. And we found that, and we used a measure, the work personality profile, which comes from the world of work, and it allows you to make judgments about attitudes and work interpersonal behaviors, as indicated here. We found that when we again assessed the range of measures, the measures that predicted employers' ratings of interpersonal, employers' ratings of workplace interpersonal behavior were a combination of executive, mentalizing, and emotion recognition. So interestingly, it was mentalizing and executive goal-oriented behavior that were more potent predictors than emotion recognition. So if you kind of compare the two social contexts, so emotion recognition is really important in resonating with your romantic partner, but mentalizing, thinking about other people's perspectives is more important for appropriate interactions with your work colleagues or your line manager or whatever. So again, different social contexts require different social cognition skills. All right, I'm going to shift over. And you think about in the workplace, our demands on mentalizing are huge. Our demands on social game playing are huge, right? Workplace politics. You know, some people are very good at their jobs, but struggle with workplace politics. Some people are kind of mediocre at their jobs, but can really work their communication or relationships with other people in their workplace, and so do well in their jobs because of that. And obviously some job roles require that emotional intelligence, is called in the corporate industry, to, you know, to that empathy in a very particular kind of way. It's a different empathy to empathy at home, but being able to, you know, read clients, read colleagues is important. And what we found in VOC rehab, I've been seeing other people in VOC rehab, but we found that this is a really hard conversation to have. Like when we set up a work placement and we brief employers about memory difficulties or about sensory adaptations, employers are really on board with that. Yeah, we'll do everything we can, and will let us know about that. They'll let us know about how the person is doing in the job itself. The elephant in the room conversation is when a survivor starts to make faux pas, says inappropriate things, or makes other people uncomfortable. It could be a small thing, such as a survivor using someone else's personal mug. And no one else would do that, but the survivor does that and makes the person feel uncomfortable. And no one can provide feedback about that. So someone taking the wrong person's mug can lead to a problem over time. Or it could be more overt, inappropriate things being shared. But what we found is that even when we put this up front and say to employers, look, this is part of the brain injury, this is going to be one of the challenges of this person resuming a work role, employers won't talk about this. And what often happens is the employers will say, yeah, everything's fine, it's fine, it's fine. And then the 11th hour will terminate the employment if they can, or terminate the work placement, and won't want to have an open conversation about their other colleagues feeling uncomfortable. But this is a huge aspect of VOC rehab. So understanding social cognition in a work context is really important. Going back to the very structured skills training approaches, I think they might have a role in some work roles here. So if a survivor goes back to a customer-facing work role, and it's highly scripted and routinized, you know, then maybe training emotion recognition or training a way to respond to other people in a very structured way would work really well when it's not a fast, heated, evolving interaction at home. If it's a formalized work interaction, that might actually be a nice way to apply a social cognition skills training strategy if you're not expecting it to generalize beyond that role, for example. All right. But you can also use other things, executive strategies as well. All right, so I'm nearly there, guys. Let's broaden that completely. Friendship, community. We know that people we survived are often socially isolated, aren't they? They lose friends, lose people. And the literature shows us out that difficulties with perspective taking are shown with problems in community integration, altered relationships with friendships. I'd really encourage you to check out Christian Salas's work. Christian is now in Chile, but he was in Bangor. Leanne Rowland, who is in Bangor, does some really wonderful work on understanding the impact of brain injury on friendship and also developing friendship interventions. We know that, you know, well-being, reconstruction of identity for survivors is dependent on social group, leisure group membership. We know that friendship groups can go horribly wrong, both in the community and online. So again, people can fall away if faux pas are made in social interactions. And so this is where we get to, along with our couples work, this is the one other example of using a live social relationship as a social cognition intervention. So Leanne Tor and colleagues have developed social communication partner training, where they take like a support worker role and have the person have a support worker as like a social buddy, being alongside survivors as they negotiate their social lives. Now, the communication partner will give frank feedback on a social faux pas. So saying, you know, that made me feel uncomfortable. That's not appropriate. That's going to lead to problems. But they're still there for them. That the social relationship isn't severed as a result of the transgression. So there's someone giving live social feedback to survivors as they negotiate their social lives. And another one that's been developed by Hillary and colleagues at UCL involves the SUPERB studies. So it's a peer befriending group for people with aphasia and social communication difficulties. Again, a befriending approach. One of the projects I'm involved in is with the charity Different Strokes, and we have a peer befriending telephone service where stroke survivors are offering phone-based support to other stroke survivors aged 16 to 25 as they negotiate their social lives. So there's a huge, you know, we often forget about friendships and social groups, but there's a huge avenue to understand the impact of social cognition impairments and ways of supporting relationships as well. Christian Salas and I, in the book last year, we applied attachment theory to think about, you know, if attachment theory is defined as, you know, our mammalian attachment systems work by seeking the proximity of a significant other to regulate our emotional distress. If the hardware to that attachment system is damaged, then there's going to be a vicious cycle across relationships, across communities of other people falling away, increasing isolation, and increasing dysregulation of emotional distress, which pushes other people away. So we're trying to link the emotions and the social networks to show how this can unfold as a negative kind of ripple across time. All right, last bit. How about us? How about us as clinicians? We're not immune, are we? And for those of you who've worked both short-term and long-term with clients, I'm sure you have experiences of really difficult therapy encounters, feeling really distressed or uncomfortable by what someone has done or said to you. And maybe then you've been able to walk away from it. Maybe you had a shitty evening or week back at home and then got back and done it again. I think we get a taste in those moments of what it's like for families and friends around survivors. We really feel that socially eroding ripple or wave that characterizes many neuro conditions. Yet we don't often talk about it, do we? We don't. It's not common parlance in a neuro rehab team to talk about the emotional impact of the work, and particularly our non-psychology colleagues. You know, the other rehab professions maybe are less equipped to think about how they can be impacted by negative social interactions with clients, and how that actually is assessment information that lets us know what is happening for the survivor all around their relationship. So we know that Lisa Lewis in 1999 talked about, from a psychodynamic perspective, the kind of countertransference phenomena in clinicians. And she mapped out that often, many times, in response to a patient's deficit, clinicians can enact a rescue fantasy or feel helpless and afraid. Or in response to a patient's attitude towards a deficit, like their awareness of the deficit, clinicians can end up enacting a collusive denial of the impact of the deficit, or switch to a irritation or overzealous confrontation of what's wrong with the client in a kind of Hollywood-style approach that never ever works. Or how the one at the bottom, how survivors can idealize us or denigrate us, place us up onto a pedestal and then into the gutter, as we become the savior and solution, and then the persecutor of all their problems, and just as bad as everyone else. And how we can experience pride or uneasiness or anger and submission in response to that. I think it's a really, really interesting paper. But taking that with a more of an empirical angle, I collaborated with Michael Schoenberger, who's done loads of work on Therapeutic Working Alliance in neurorehab. So Therapeutic Working Alliance has been shown to predict clinicians' ratings of survivor awareness, the compliance of the survivor in rehabilitation, reduction in depression symptoms during rehab, and in post-rehab, the therapeutic working reliance between survivors and clinicians can predict employment, family discord, productivity, incongruity between family and clinicians' ratings of survivor functioning. So Michael Schoenberg did all his work on the Therapeutic Working Alliance predicts rehab outcomes and functioning outcomes for survivors. But what then predicts Therapeutic Working Alliance? He found previously that tests of survivor attention, memory, higher cognitive functions yielded weak predictive relationships. So we looked at, well, does social cognition, survivor social cognitive functioning, predict Therapeutic Working Alliance? And in a clustered regression model, we indeed found that the main predictors were emotion recognition ability in the survivors, and also the survivor's ability to recognize appropriate or inappropriate social interactions, and to a lesser extent, again, an executive element, predicted the tendency of clinicians to rate their relationship with survivors as negative or not. And it makes sense, doesn't it? It makes sense that, you know, if a survivor is not going to pick up on social cues, not recognize the emotion of the therapist, is not going to apply what's socially appropriate or not, then rehab sessions themselves are going to be problematic. And so you get this paradox where, you know, survivors are looking to a professional relationship to help them manage their social relationships in their lives, yet the professional relationship itself is victim to that same socially eroding consequence of brain injury. And that brings us to a bit of a conclusion, really, because, you know, however you think about social cognition, you can't get away from it because we are social beings. And I hope I've kind of highlighted how that can have an impact on different social relationships, including our own. And, you know, when we struggle in our therapeutic alliances and our therapeutic relationships with survivors, it's probably because of the same issues that are affecting other relationships. So I think individually or with colleagues, we can think about, you know, these ideas around social cognition assessment, rehabilitation, to try and get a handle on, for each survivor, what are they picking up from other people? What are they missing? You know, where are the impact channels we can use? Where are there blocks? What can we do about that? And what can we do about that is embryonic. Some people think you can train aspects to it. Some people think you can actually turn up the volume with the heat on it. So actually it'll automatically unfold in certain conditions. So it's a range of paradigms, I think, for us to pick and choose from. But hopefully I think that's been useful in highlighting what's out there at the minute. If you want more, the first few, a couple of resources. So for the first few months of lockdown, I turned a lot of my presentations into online courses on Udemy. And if you click on my website, you can get the links to I've got a longer version of this talk and also other topics as well. You can log on to that and subscribe to those on Udemy. There's some free talks on my website as well. And also on a different page on my website, there are resources for survivors and families, videos, articles, information sheets. So all tackling the issue of relationships and adjustment and emotion generally. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Giles. In the words of my karate instructor, Master Trudgill, that was epic. Really good. Couldn't have had a better start than that. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Right. I think we've if you're okay, if we could have time, maybe time for a couple of quick questions. We haven't got too long. Has anybody got any questions they would like to ask? I have. I'm going to let other people get in there first if they've got any. No, okay. So it's okay if there's no others. If I could ask a quick one, Giles. Listening to this, if you were someone that was doing your QICN or your Bristol course equivalent, and you're sitting there thinking, oh my goodness, this stuff rocks. I've got to get me some of this in the form of a case study. What would your advice be to someone who says, right, I've got massive caseload of people with ventromedial prefrontal cortex damage and these kind of problems. I'd really like to do some kind of rehab case study based around this. What would be your advice in terms of, okay, don't do that because that's a bit too ambitious, or maybe start with this? What would be your advice to someone?
That's a really good question. And I've actually, in the social cognition literature, the really inspiring papers have been literally those single cases, even if it's around assessment. So there's a wonderful paper by Lisa Cipollotti that did a double dissociation of social cognition impairments of one kind versus another. So I think case studies are definitely great, you know, because there's so much diversity as well. We'll learn more by the accumulation of single cases. I would say first get a practice of assessing it. So know what it is you're dealing with. Don't assume you know what the core social cognition impairment is. You know, and often people don't assess it. So I say start assessing people if you can, or maybe not routinely. If you've got an inclination that someone has a struggle, maybe try some of these tests on them, be it a social vignette test or an emotion recognition, and see what's intact, what's not. And then use that to think about, okay, how would that link to some of their goals? You know, it might be a return to work goal. It might be relationships in the family. See, could you apply some of the intervention work for a very specific subset of communication with other people? And try that. By all means, get in touch, and we can always think about it together. But I think not enough people assess. Know what the impairment is that you're dealing with first of all, and then think about how could you apply for a meaningful goal for that survivor. And then maybe that the survivor's not telling you there's a problem, but maybe that's someone else in their life telling you there's a problem, right? That the employer or the relative is saying this is a problem. So it might be that you can take a training approach, or you can incorporate a training approach into your psychotherapy intervention.
Fantastic. Is there any other questions? To be honest, I've got loads, but we haven't got time.
No worries.
Okay, that was absolutely fantastic, Giles. Thank you so much for that. That was brilliant. Thank you so much to everybody that came along. And I do have a few more speakers provisionally lined up, so hopefully we can fit these in on a fairly regular basis. So thanks a lot, everybody, and see you later.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
See you.